Everyone. Thanks for being here on a lovely evening here in London. I'm Chris Simmons. I'm the Director of Programming here at the Conduit. Tonight we turn our attention to a topic that could hardly be more vital: the defense of human rights in an age of political turbulence, technological disruption, and widening inequality. From free speech and privacy to the right to protest and live free from discrimination, the principles we often take for granted are facing new and complex threats. We're honored to welcome Shami Chakrabarti, one of Britain's most respected voices on civil liberties. As former Director of Liberty and a legislator in the House of Lords, Shami has been on the front lines of human rights advocacy for over 2 decades. Her books on liberty and of women have shaped national conversations about justice, freedom, and equality. And if you haven't already, please do pick up a copy of Shami's latest book, Human Rights: The Case for the Defense, and stick around afterwards, where she'll be signing copies right over there. In conversation with her this evening is Hannah McInnes, a journalist, broadcaster, and seasoned interviewer who brings thoughtful insight into the urgent questions of our time. Towards the end of the conversation, we'll be opening up it to all of you folks. So as it transpires, the conversation develops, start thinking of those questions, and we'll be around with a microphone to give you all that opportunity. If you're joining us for the first time, thank you for being here. If you're a Conduit member, thank you for being here. And if you're curious about what we do and want to learn more, if you're not a member, check in with our front desk for more information. So enough from me. Please help me give a warm welcome for Shami Chakrabarti and Hannah McInnes.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Chris, for remembering all the important things that I might have forgotten to say. So that's wonderful. We can just get straight to the interview. I'll just say another thank you very much for all being here and choosing, I feel, very wisely and very well how to spend your Thursday evening. And I know you'll agree when we get to the end of the hour and 15 minutes. So you say, because this is obviously the paperback out in May, and in that preface that you wrote in January 2025, I think, you say the turbulence of the times into which this book was born has only intensified. So can you just describe when the turbulence into which the book was born at the very beginning and that intensification, why it is so timely and so relevant now?
Well, thank you, Hannah. So I get to say why I'm so timely and relevant now. I don't know whether... What I think is that human rights are under threat. You know, I can't mince my words for you. They are under unprecedented threat. And not just because there are difficult issues about protest here or war there or et cetera, but because even the framework, even belief in maintaining the post-World War II rules-based order, even that concept is under threat. So I'm concerned that if we're not careful, we're going to lose these tools that were so hard won over centuries by people from around the world. And I try and make that argument in the early chapters of the book, because there's this argument that human rights are kind of foreign. They're foreign, like nice wine, or Europe, or they're sort of alien concepts, and they're not British, like Magna Carta. Well, what do you think Magna Carta was but a primitive part of a broader international conversation about rights and freedoms? And even before aeroplanes, there was so much collaboration between writers and activists and thinkers in America, on the continent of Europe, in Britain. Somebody like Thomas Paine was involved in, both the American and the French revolutions. So this idea that rights are just this kind of post-World War II confection that's been imposed on Britain is very, very ahistoric and untrue, but it's a sort of part of the sort of post-Brexit thing. Now, whatever your views about Brexit, it's not over yet, because it's not a policy, it's a feeling. It's an appetite that can never be sated. And you wake up one day and the oven-ready deal was done, and et cetera, but you don't feel that satisfaction that you thought you were going to feel. So you need to be offered, something further. You need to be mainlining, even harder Brexit. And of course, and therefore, unsurprisingly, even Britain's membership of the Council of Europe and signatory status to the European Convention on Human Rights is directly under threat. Yes, by Monsieur Farage and the Reform Party, but also a lot of people in the Conservative Party, and really the concern that led me to write the book, and I started during COVID, because you have to, I know it's only a little book, but you have to do a lot of reading to write a little bit, in my view. I know you're a girly swat too, Hannah, we discussed it. So I started during COVID in the hope that coming out of COVID would be like a 1945 moment. All that clapping of the nurses. Do you remember we used to bang the pots and pans for the nurses? Well, I think they'd be glad of a pay rise now, wouldn't they? So they don't have to go to food banks. So I think a moment was lost, if I'm honest, post-COVID, and people were probably ready for a bit of a 1945 moment. They didn't get it, and now it's feeling a bit more like the 1930s to me. So, and look, you can point to the examples, what's happening in the US, what's happening even here in the UK in terms of certain movements and certain attitudes that are just really quite cruel and quite illiberal, anti-rights freedoms, even anti the rule of law. Slagging off the courts. Stop the boats, but stop the courts. So that's the kind of environment that I think I'm talking about.
Yeah, that's the turbulence. And I was interested, you used the word at the beginning there about unprecedented, because in the book, and clearly there is so much research, and it is a small book, but my word, there's so much in there, and you learn so much from it. But you say unprecedented now. Obviously, the book charts the struggles that have gone on to defend human rights throughout history, long before 1947, 1948. So why is this moment then unprecedented?
I think because people want to rip it all up.
Right.
And they want to do it all over the world. And the nature of the 21st century is so global and so interconnected that someone like Elon Musk can put a social media message out in wherever he is, in Washington or California, and people can think about rioting in Liverpool. So, and I do argue in the book that one of our problems is that human rights are rights formally that we have against governments, when actually the new empires are not governments. It's not a British Empire or a Russian Empire or a French Empire that you're dealing with now. The empires are Apple, Google, Tesla, and they have logos instead of flags. And these people are wealthier than whole nations and groups of nations. They can buy and sell governments and steal elections. And, where's the universal suffrage? Who's holding this kind of power to account? They have such Byzantine structures. Some of these fossil fuel companies, for example, will incorporate. I don't know. Maybe you incorporate in. That's somebody who's cross with me. You incorporate in the Netherlands or in London. You mine in the Niger Delta. You sell your product all over the world. You're exploiting working people here. The shareholders are there, and the legal structures are really, really Byzantine. And if you are someone in the Niger Delta and your environment and your home is being destroyed, where are you going to take legal action? So you take legal action maybe in the Niger Delta, and Royal Dutch Shell says, no, it's the wrong location because we're incorporated in the Netherlands or in London, and these poor people are desperately trying to play catch up with these huge, powerful forces, and it's very challenging.
It's interesting, though, because one of the central arguments you make in the book is that even though you're just saying that the rules that were written aren't fit for purpose in that sense, given those threats and the way the world has changed, but one of the things I took from the book is that you're quite passionate about those laws that were written in the late 40s. I mean, you say the infinite wisdom of the universal human rights coined long ago still, in its infinite wisdom, has become more, not less valuable as the years have passed. And to me, that's one of the things I really took from the book that was a passion of yours, that don't question the validity of these, even because of the passage of time.
Well, who's going to argue with free speech, fair trials, no torture, no slavery? I mean, is somebody going to argue with, even in the abstract, there are people who say, no, this is all antiquated nonsense. There are people who say that. I hear them in the House of Lords on a regular basis. So that's what's at stake. And what I really wanted for the book is for politically interested non-lawyers to be able to know their rights. Just where they what they are, what they're not, a little bit of history, a little bit of context, and be able to name them. Just name them. You know, I argue that if you can name the players in your favourite football team, the actors in your favourite soap opera, you should know your basic convention rights. Just as an adult human being. You don't have to be a lawyer, you don't have to be... And so many people don't, including eminent journalists, politicians, all sorts of people who have got big opinions about human rights. But do they, if you were to challenge them, would they really be able to even articulate what they are? So I wanted to inform the debate, because that's a good start, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, yes, you say, your words, not mine. I believe human rights values must animate living rooms, classrooms and courtrooms, cabinet interrogation and even war rooms, and that this book is specifically not principally for lawyers. And, I mean, you've just really said it, but just can you explain why that is so important? Because it's your mission through this book is to, tell us those basic rights that we all have. What do we do with that? What's your hope that your reader does with that?
Well, I hope that it enhances people's lives and helps them to navigate difficult situations, whether at home or in the workplace or in the community. You know, it's not just about a courtroom. It's about having the language to challenge abuses of power, and having the language when you have a bit of power to try and navigate, you know, challenging situations and conflict and so on, because there's only a certain number of ways of dealing with disputes between people, right? What are they? Violence, you know, agreement by, you know, some kind of contractual agreement, violence, some sort of electoral political solution, or some kind of adjudication. There's only so many ways, and really, it's always said right at the top of human rights documents, going right back to the Universal Declaration, this is to help us not have to go to war all the time. This is to give us a language for negotiation and navigation, so we don't have to kill each other all the time. Now, we're not doing so well at that at the minute, which is the turbulent times again, but I just think adult people living in this great city, for example, but certainly living in one of the wealthiest, most educated countries in the world, need to just know what their basic rights and freedoms are, where they came from, and be able to smell the lies that are being peddled every day about human rights by people who want to take them away.
I certainly want to talk more about war, unfortunately, because we must. But that closer to home thing, you know, you just alluded to, that we should know about our human rights because it's not just in the courtroom, it's closer to home. And that's famously Eleanor Roosevelt, who was an architect of one of the first times that human rights as a phrase was coined at the Universal Declaration. Tell us a little bit more about that, because I know that closer to home thing is important to you.
I mean, she's obviously an extraordinary woman. You know, I'm sure you know, she's President Roosevelt's wife, and after the war, she became a very, very important convening figure in the discussions that led to the Universal Declaration, which is the great big inspirational document that we get in 1948, from which come all the more, and it has no legal force, but it's a hugely inspirational global document. And from that, we end up with our European Convention and our American Convention, et cetera, et cetera. And she was obviously just a complete powerhouse and was able to bring people together, and, you know, Soviets and Chinese people and people of different religions, and she was, with her sheer energy, and I think a lot of tea drinking went on, you know, they came up with this declaration. Extraordinary thing to achieve. I don't think there's anything quite like it since, really, in terms of statecraft. You think about that level of agreement. It's pretty much almost world agreement. We can't get world agreement on sharing COVID vaccines properly in the 21st century. There isn't that level of statecraft. But her famous quote is, "Human rights begin in small places close to home." You know, it's places so small and so close you will never find them on any map of the world, but that is where the person lives. Human rights, you know, so they're in a home where, you know, there are issues about how to protect a child. You might have children or grandchildren, you're thinking about what is the right balance to strike about their social media use or their mobile phone use. And, you know, I want them to have a bit of agency, I want them to be learning about the world, but I also want to protect them, you know. So these are all questions of human rights, because the child has, even a small child has embryonic rights to privacy and freedom of expression and so on, but they also need to be protected. So my argument is that even before you get anywhere near a courtroom or laws, these values can help us deal with ethical issues, even as a parent or a grandparent or a teacher or an employer.
But often those values, those private values, well, I think you dispute the use of the word clash, but they do seem to clash with the bigger human rights values outside of that small space. So one of the things you talk about, for example, is with religious freedom. So the right to religious freedom might very much clash with the idea of equality and gender equality, or the right for women to be priests, or, you know, the right to decide what happens to your unborn baby. These are huge clashes of rights.
There are certainly tensions and sometimes over clashes, there's no doubt about that. But what I would say is that most of our rights and freedoms are not absolute. This is a very important distinction to make. It's human rights 101, that there are some human rights which are absolute. Torture and slavery. Never, 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 even in time of war, blah, blah, blah. We have just decided as a race that torture, never, never, never. Now, some people have been trying for years, but in the war on terror, there were all sorts of people. Alan Dershowitz, you know, Harvard law professor, saying, well, maybe a little bit of torture if it's under judicial warrant. I kid you not. No. But that torture is the big no, absolute. But most of our rights and freedoms are what we call qualified or balanced rights. Privacy is an obvious example, right? Because we are social creatures. Here's another misnomer. Human rights are selfish and individualistic. I wish people wouldn't bang on about their rights the whole time. What about responsibilities? What about responsibilities? Well, we're actually subject to a lot of law and a lot of regulation and a lot of responsibilities. We should have a few rights just to protect us from powerful people. And what's more, you know, we have to protect other people's rights. And that's our ethical responsibility. That was said by Tom Paine hundreds of years ago. He said, during the drafting of the French Declaration, this is after the French Revolution, somebody said, shouldn't there be, if there's a declaration of rights, shouldn't there also be a declaration of responsibilities? And Tom Paine said, this demonstrates a mind that has reflected, but not enough. Because by reciprocity, a declaration of rights is also a declaration of responsibilities, because you cannot be protected from torture without people being responsible to protect you from torture, for example. So yes, you can call them clashes. Sometimes there are genuine clashes. Sometimes the right just has to be balanced with another right. Privacy and free speech are often in tension. Religious freedom and equal treatment are often in tension. But again, this is the strength of the framework, that it gives us tools for navigating those tensions.
I mean, can I ask you specifically about that one? Because I found I kept writing in the margins a few question marks when it came to the right for religious freedom, you said means that you should have the right to stop women being ordained as priests. You should have the right to say you have less rights as a woman.
You can say what you like within reason, as long as you're not inciting violence, in my view. And if you don't want me in your community, in your religious community, you have the right to not have me in your religious community. What you can't do is torture children, because that's an absolute right. And you can't impose your views on other people. And, so there are limits to what is a qualified right. You've got an absolute freedom of conscience to believe what you like, but the manifestation of that conscience is balanced and qualified by other people's rights and freedoms.
I mean, you talk in that...
Maybe I strike the balance in a different place to where you would strike it. I mean, I use examples just to demonstrate how we might approach these questions, not because I'm right about all of the problems that I describe in the book.
So it is fluid in that sense, or who do you then look to cast that defining judgment?
Well, I mean, in some cases, relatively few actually, it will end up in a Supreme Court or a Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, or I don't know, maybe one day the Intergalactic Court of Human Rights on Venus or something. But actually, because this is not just law, it is ethics and morals and all of those things too. We are navigating this in our workplace, in our community, in our family, and so on.
One thing it might be helpful to do is go back a little bit further from 1947, because you do say that it neither invented human rights nor did it define them, and the development had in practice begun long ago. And I think in terms of these things we're discussing now, the sort of supposed clashes, it's really interesting that history that you describe. The foundations were laid long before then.
Well, that's right. I mean, people talk about Nuremberg being, the first big international sort of war crimes tribunal and blah, blah, blah. But, they were, if you think back to the slave trade, there were courts and tribunals that were a bit like Nuremberg, and they were adjudicating on piracy on the high seas and people that were enslaving others and transporting them even back then. And I tell those stories so that people realise this was not just made up after the war. It's a little confection, and we've had that time, let's get rid of it. It runs very, very deep. And it was always internationally inspired. There were whether it was the campaign for women's votes or to end slavery, or for people to be, or for anyone to be able to vote, for working people to be able to vote. All of these struggles, many of these struggles had an international dimension, even pre-internet, pre-aeroplanes. As soon as people could write and share their ideas, these struggles that start in a local place start feeding off each other.
And where we end up, those foundations, those international foundations, end up where we were in 1947. But all of them are this thing you describe, I think, as a living instrument. Yeah. This is the important way to see why all of that builds up to human rights and ideas of what constitutes human rights that become relevant each day in different ways. And that's what you mean by a living instrument.
This is super helpful, Hannah. Thank you for the sort of gentle, subtle way that you so living instrument, this is a very controversial subject, and it's one that divides human rights hawks and doves. So the hawks, the anti-brigade, who think it's all gone too far.
Can you just tell us who they are, the rights nationalists, that voice? Brilliant.
Some of them are predictably on the right wing of politics, but some of them are actually on the left wing of politics too. I have to be honest about that, and I've cited these people. But what some of them have in common, or what they have in common, whether they're on the far left or the populist right, is nationalism. So they don't like they don't like the international, universal nature of human rights. So that's one problem. But the other thing is this living instrument doctrine, which is that they think that these documents were all right in terms of what they meant when they were written by white men with beards. but they shouldn't be applied, they shouldn't be adapted and applied to modern times. And they take that view about the ECHR from 1950, but they take that view about the American Bill of Rights too, and it's a totally illogical view. Because if you think about it, if we said the right to respect for your private life, your family life, and your correspondence will only mean what was in the minds of the people drafting that in 1950. That's the rule. That's the opposite of living instrument. That's set in aspic. And there should be no contemporary application, which is the living instrument document. If we have that, there would be no protection for electronic communications, because that wasn't even conceived of, that there would be computers. Gay people would not be protected by private and family life, because to have a gay relationship was illegal for so many people all over the world, and probably approved of even by some drafters of the convention, and so on and so forth. And if you want to go further back, and go back to the American Bill of Rights, they don't even expressly write about things like privacy. They read in concepts of privacy into the idea of an unlawful search. And they've just applied it in context. And free speech, everyone says, in America, free speech is absolute. Yeah, the First Amendment, absolute free speech. You can't interfere with. That's rubbish, isn't it? Because they have laws on child pornography and breach of copyright and inciting terrorism and all the rest of it too. So this living instrument thing is not only sensible, it's just a fact. It has always happened that courts will ultimately take these documents and apply them to contemporary times. And one of the challenges of human rights is you want them to be a little bit semi-sacred. You don't want them to be just amended or repealed every year or every 5 years when there's a different government. You want them to be permanent and to last for hundreds of years. But that does mean that you have to apply those values to changing circumstances, including the climate emergency, by the way, which again is very controversial to some of these people who don't want us to apply human rights principles to the climate emergency. Very important case last year in Switzerland, in the Strasbourg court, finding Switzerland in breach of various human rights based on not addressing its climate responsibilities. All sorts of hawks. So that's just outrageous. Judicial activism is the phrase that's used. But if your life is threatened and your family and your shelter and your home are threatened by the fact that your government is not taking action on climate change, of course you're going to pick up whatever you've got to try and defend yourself.
What do you think they find, what's their reason for finding that so preposterous?
Because, let's be honest, some of these people don't really feel as I do about the climate emergency anyway. Some of them are denialists. There are still, there's still a healthy percentage or unhealthy percentage of climate change denialists. And maybe it's, maybe they don't want to imagine a world beyond their own lifetime. Maybe they're just so narcissistic that, when I'll be gone anyway. Who cares about my children and my grandchildren and the people in low-lying island nations who are going to feel it worse? And so there's a bit of that, and they think, well, it's preposterous that we should be applying human rights principles drafted in 1950 to this idea of climate change, again, that wasn't even thought about in 1950. Yeah. No, it wasn't. But it was thought about in 1989. I've got one of my little surprise quotes in the book. Actually, should I try it out?
Yeah.
This is my favourite parlour game, which makes me a very boring person, or a slightly swotty person.
There we go. You've got your post-its as well.
I've got my post-its. Okay, so who said... You have to guess who said this in 1989. And you can't answer before I've started reading.
But you can't answer.
There's always somebody. They're often sitting in the front row. And sometimes they're a friend of mine. And I'm like, what? I'm like, but you've read the book. Why are you doing it? But it's just an instinct, right? What we are now doing to the world by degrading the land surfaces, by polluting the waters and by adding greenhouse gases to the air at an unprecedented rate, all this is new in the experience of the Earth. It is mankind and his activities which are changing the environment of our planet in damaging and dangerous ways. We should always remember that free markets are a means to an end. They would defeat their object if by their output they did more damage to the quality of life through pollution than the well-being they achieve by the production of goods and services. Each country has to contribute, and those countries who are industrialized must contribute more to help those who are not. 1989. Who said that? Obviously, it can't be Greta Thunberg because she wasn't even imagined by her parents. Did you say David Attenborough? Margaret Thatcher, yeah. So
Well done. The prize will, yeah.
But you won't see that talked about in the Daily Mail or the Daily Telegraph, will you? All these people on the right of our politics who venerate Margaret Thatcher, they venerate in a piecemeal, convenient fashion, don't they?
Well, that's actually, okay, that's a really interesting separate point about media freedom, talking about the Daily Mail, and you won't see that there. I mean, again, another difficult thing to square is media rights, which is a human right in a world where many media organizations, news organizations seem to be very much kind of hand in hand with totalitarianism, as you write, and dictators. It's hard to say, well, they should have their media freedom, because it goes against,
well, again,
the right of many other rights.
like every kind of free expression is very precious, but it's not absolute, like torture. You don't have an absolute right to defame me, to incite murder, to do all sorts of things. And I think in particular now with social media, we've got to try and re-evaluate and navigate the dangers that come with the online world in particular, because people are being taken down these rabbit holes of not just, the untruth stuff is very problematic, but also people are being sent into dark rabbit holes of self-harming and suicide and gambling and really, really dark, deep, fake, violent pornography. And you know, the freedom part has to be balanced against the other rights in play, the right not to be tortured, degraded, discriminated against, and so on.
I think I come back to the question then, who decides that? Who weighs that balance? Who gets to say which one wins out?
Well, so we start close to home when you're having your debates with your family and your teenagers about whether they get to use the mobile phone. Well, then I guess you get to decide to some extent, and then the teachers and the head teachers get to decide what happens, and so on and so forth, and then governments and ultimately courts. But there aren't enough courts and there aren't enough police officers on the planet for our human rights to only be delivered that way. So we have to know what we're talking about so that we can make it our best fist of it, so that everything doesn't come to terrible conflict and court.
I mean, that idea of social media and technology and AI is an area where I feel that your passion for and conviction for what was decided all those years ago wavers, and that is somewhere where it is a very hard sea to navigate. And you say clear and present dangers to our rights not to be degraded to fair process around important decisions to privacy, expression, association and discrimination, that you've spent many years arguing with yourself about what human rights approaches to regulating the internet would look like. I mean, has one of yourselves...
Yeah, in honesty, I'm a bit less libertarian about online free expression than I used to be. In particular because of AI and because of some things like deep fake intimate images, predominantly of women and girls. But that, you know, I'm almost not convinced that it's free expression at all to take any woman's image from the internet or on your mobile phone, because you're here at an event. Take a picture of any woman here, put it into an app that you can pay for, and create pornographic images of her without her consent. Now, some people consider that freedom of expression. because that's your creativity and it's your fantasy. And, well, you know, this is not a cartoon, this is not a drawing, this is a deep, this looks like her. And you don't even need to share the image, because if everybody has the app, everybody can do it. And any girl or woman who walks into the classroom or the workplace will know that all of the guys who are sniggering may or may not have images of her like that they're being encouraged to produce by the, I don't know, the odious Tate brothers, etc., etc. So I'm a lot less liberal stroke libertarian about that aspect of expression, because I think of the other side of the equation, which is women and girls being seriously degraded, and the flavour of our society and our ability to relate to each other, like, totally changing.
Which argument then with yourself has won out? Because you do present solutions, that idea that you've been going round and round what a human rights approach to this should look like.
Well, I think, look, in the end, look, I passionately believe in these old instruments, but we need more of them. I've come to, you know,
we need a new instrument for this.
We need a treaty. There will have to be an internet treaty.
Who will facilitate that?
Well, it would have to be at international. It would have to be at UN level. You know, we've got treaties for outer space, for the oceans, and I think of the internet as a new continent, and it's a lawless continent, and people have been making lots of money there in this place, but there's no sheriff in town. And it's even scarier than that, because all our friends and family and colleagues and neighbours can zap, like Star Trek, they can zap in and out of this continent at a moment's notice and spend more and more of their time there. Some people spend more time on the internet than they do in the quote-unquote real world, and lots of bad stuff is happening there. There has to be some international treaty governing standards for behaviour on the internet.
I mean,
and then with AI, with algorithmic tools, I think we need even more specific regulation, as we have for weapons and we have for pharmaceuticals. Some products should be banned. Some products should be approved on a case-by-case basis, as we do with weapons and drugs, for example. And some would be used for some purposes and not for other purposes. There has to be, I think, a lot of very heavy regulation of AI. Otherwise, some really bad stuff is going to happen.
Do you have hope that that might happen? Because the people very much in control that we spoke about at the beginning, the bigger corporations and the tech bros in Silicon Valley, will very much wish for that not to be the case.
It's a challenge. I can't run away from the challenge it is. But there are some people in Silicon Valley who, were early adopters and are now quite disillusioned, and some of them are quite wealthy. I mean, there just needs to be we need statespeople like we had in that wartime period. We need people to step up and tell a story and say, this is what we want our country to be like, and this is what we want the world to be like, and this is great technology, this is cool technology, we can do amazing things. It's going to be much easier to spot cancer than it was with AI assisting doctors, for example. I think it could be super helpful in finally achieving equal pay. We've had equal pay legislation in the UK for 50 years this year. We're nowhere near equal pay. Why? Because it's left to individual women in the workplace. I mean, God bless Barbara Castle, but there was a fatal flaw from the beginning. It's left to an individual woman worker to find out what the blokes are getting paid, find out, not just for the same job, but for equivalent work. So in the local authority, the care worker has to try and find out what the bin men are getting paid, and then she's got to argue it's equivalent work, and people will push back. And then if she wants to enforce equal pay legislation, she's got to sue her employer. Who's got time or energy or money for that? If you've got a union that gets behind you, fine, you're still talking 15 years. So guess what? We don't have equal pay. But if we had some state regulation and enforcement of equal pay, AI could be super helpful, because it would be really so much easier to take payroll information and be randomly making comparisons and so on at pace. So there are wonderful things that you can use this technology for, like drugs, but there are really bad things that you can use this technology for as well. And it's already being used unregulated by the police to decide that we've got facial recognition technology being used by the Metropolitan Police on the streets not very far from here. You see the vans with the cameras, and they're scooping up people's images and deciding who gets stopped and searched. And who made the watch list? They did. They decide who gets stopped and searched. You know, there's no law governing this at all. And that is terrifying to me when we've had a Police and Criminal Evidence Act in this country since 1984. So that's just one example. In the US, sentencing decisions are being assisted by AI. People are not getting job interviews and not getting insurance policies. All sorts of very significant decisions are being made about you and your family, potentially, unregulated by law on the basis of this code that is owned by a private company, based on public information and locked in a black box.
But what you talk about when you're describing that, the police and their powers is, and your worry, as I understand it, is the innate bias that's written into AI at this moment.
Well, this is one of the problems, isn't it? That you can bake in every injustice and inequality on the planet can be baked in to the technology. And there's a wonderful Netflix documentary called Coded Bias, which if it's still up there, I would recommend it. And there's this, a lot of the really interesting work on this is coming out of the US for obvious reasons, places like MIT and elsewhere. And there's a part in this documentary where you see this young black PhD student, I think, in the US, and she put her face into some technology, some facial recognition technology online, and she just was invisible. And then she put a white mask on, and suddenly you saw her face, because the guys who developed this technology were white men in Silicon Valley, and the training data that you use is going to affect the outcomes. So if all the training data says, well, criminals look like this, geniuses look like that, dogs look like this, but wolves look like that, if it's just the presence of snow that makes something, do you know what I mean? So you've got to be so careful. The phrase is rubbish in, rubbish out. And of course, this is turbocharged. So, because it's done at high speed and it's done in vast quantities. So we really need to open up the black box, and we need to legislate. I think in the end we'll need statutes that have code attached to them in schedules. I won't be able to read the code, but some people can't read the law, but we still say we should have law, right?
I mean, it's so fascinating, and we could easily talk about each chapter for the whole hour. I've not got that much longer until it's time for audience questions. So I want to go back to what we parked at the beginning was, of course, war, because you said, as you say in the book, that we're hardly winning there, given the whole idea is that if human rights were winning, we wouldn't have so many conflicts around the world. And it is certainly the place where people would be able to say, well, what's the point? What's the point of the UN if it can call, on our member states? This is particularly, for example, with hostilities in Gaza. The UN will call on member states to take decisive action to end hostilities, ensure accountability for grave breaches of international law committed over the past year and a half. That's their words. Nothing changes. And it's certainly an area where people say, what's the point? It's not working.
This is an enormous challenge. And there's no event that I do, there's no place that I go to talk about this book where there aren't young people in particular who want to say, what about Gaza? What is the point if we are watching this kind of devastating destruction of innocent babies and people, people who are not Hamas, people who didn't perpetrate the atrocity, human rights atrocity that was October the 7th. Let's be clear about that. But what is the point? Well, the point is we have the values, we have the language to animate our demand to those in authority to do something about this, to be a bit more muscular in their response to the lawlessness that I believe is being, the lawlessness of Mr. Netanyahu's government, not the people of Israel, not the poor hostages and their families, but this government, this particular government at this particular time in this country is behaving in an appalling way with relative impunity, and we need the international community to step up. The language is changing a bit, but we need more than language. We need probably sanctions. We need to stop selling arms. We need to take economic sanction.
Why isn't that happening?
Well, there's I mean, it's some countries have, you know, some countries are, some European countries have done more than we have, but I sense that, I hope, I believe that the evidence is just so devastating now, and the situation is worse and worse day by day, that I hope and believe that things are going to change. Even President Trump must realise that this is out of control. But one of the things I do say is one of the problems with the UN model is the Security Council. This is the problem with things that are set in a period of time. The permanent members of the Security Council, as we know, are the winners of World War II. So America, Russia, France, Britain. Should Britain really still be there? I don't know. France, Britain, China. And the idea after World War II was, well, these will be the cops. You know, they are the permanent members of the Security Council because they're the people who, if push comes to shove, and we need some kind of international action to prevent a Holocaust or to, you know, help a country that's been illegally invaded, whatever it is, these are the people who will be the cops and they will help. Well, of course, now we look and we see that some of these countries are just as capable of being the problem as being the solution. So there is a bit of a challenge there, but we see a more confident response from the UN General Assembly. In the end, I would like to see reform of that Security Council model, maybe even regional councils. I don't know. There's got to be something a bit more practical for the modern world. But that's the sort of machinery of enforcement of rights rather than the rights themselves. New rights, I think, we do need in relation to things like tech and AI, climate. I mean, the Refugee Convention is a very precious document under threat, but it's under threat by people who want to stop the boats, even though most of the people in the small boat, they're a tiny fraction of migration to this country, you understand. And they are the most desperate people from Afghanistan and Syria and whatever. They're not, and yet we dish out visas to people to come and do various jobs, and we can control that. But our politicians have perpetrated a swindle on the British public, where they've made it all the demonisation and the anti-rhetoric is about these desperate people who've come from places of conflict, often conflicts that we have been mixed up in. And then we'll have cheap labour, cheap international labour, thank you very much, to help unscrupulous businesses undercut domestic workers. So that is a swindle that's toxified the debate about immigration. But
From both sides, politicians on all sides, are they not really helping?
Yeah, I don't think I can't claim that, you know, Labour's been fabulous and the Tories have been awful. This has been a pattern for some years, and I was very uncomfortable with the Prime Minister's speech the other week. Got to be honest about that. You know, my parents were Commonwealth migrants, and they were beaten up by skinheads in 1970. I don't want to be hearing that kind of rhetoric from my Prime Minister. But the Refugee Convention, precious though it is not going to cope with climate change, because it won't. It really, you can be living instrument, but there's only so much you can interpret, and you know, the concept of persecution in the Refugee Convention, it's going to be very hard to apply that to many climate circumstances. So we will have to have another, some kind of protective document for people whose, as I say, their island just doesn't exist anymore. They've got to escape. Nobody wants them. Where are they going to go? And these challenges are truly international and global, and they require a new generation of statespeople to step up like that previous one did. It's my generation that have screwed up. You know, the wartime people were great, and I think a lot of the youngsters I have a lot of faith in too, but I'm pretty disillusioned with my fellow 50-somethings and 60-somethings, I have to say. Some of them not really stepped up yet.
I mean, back to that point then, in in response to everything you were just talking about wars, about refugees. We want to feel that we have some agency, and you sort of began but with the Eleanor Roosevelt point, and that's really the point of the book, about the kind of what we can do, why we should be armed with our understanding of human rights. But even when we are, we still feel, many people feel, utterly helpless when confronted with all of those enormous things that you're talking about. What can we do, even if we have the strongest understanding of our human rights and of human rights and what they constitute?
I understand that helplessness. I experience it, myself, and I've got these platforms to, pontificate. Of course, one can feel overwhelmed. You need to have just enough news to be informed, and not so much to be totally, overwhelmed by it, because it can be incredibly depressing and overwhelming. I think the answer is solidarity. The answer is to be in spaces with other people, and whether that's spaces where you're doing active things like you're campaigning, whether it's marching or whether it is lobbying, campaigning, or whether it's just being with people to talk and remind yourself that you're not alone. And there are other people with your values and not some of the hateful stuff that we're reading the whole time. I think we are social creatures. I think that's very, very important. And the human rights instruments reflect the fact that we are not, yes, we're precious individuals who shouldn't be enslaved and tortured. But if you go beyond those absolute rights and we get into free expression and privacy and family and association and expression, there you see the social animal that is a human being reflected in those rights that are really all about not just me, but about how I relate to other people, and my right to be in the world and be in the community and be in democratic society and relate to other people.
Yeah, and I mean that's a good place for me to end. One of the ways which should not be undermined, in which we do that, come together, is culture, which you write about, and you say cultural rights are often neglected, but don't underestimate the huge part that culture has played in the human rights story. Literature, the arts, drama. I mean, often governments, I think, don't see, or people in positions of authority don't see the power they have in the human rights story.
Absolutely. And there's some wonderful writing. There are some wonderful books about that specific subject, about the relationship between literature and rights struggles. When people start reading novels, they can go to places that they would never physically be able to go to. They can empathise with people that they would never, ever meet. This is before aeroplanes, and then I do think that it is no coincidence that the golden age of cinema coincides with this sort of post-war moment, and that ability to travel the world in images, and the democratization of it, and it's an empathy. In the end, a lot of this is about empathy, and solidarity. Actually, solidarity is the magic word. Some people find it a bit old-fashioned, but I think maybe it's become more fashionable again. And the beauty of it is it sort of describes the place you want to get to, the kind of society that I want to live in, but it also gives you a bit of a roadmap to how to get there. And the secret is working with other people, isn't it?
Because governments, I think, and it is a generalisation, that there is this tendency to sort of put the arts and culture into a kind of, isn't that nice box on the side. But you were quite powerfully arguing, as I really do wholly agree with you, that it is just so much more than that. I mean, the soft power, the power of it.
Look, if you're Boris Johnson and you go to Eton, or whatever, Nigel Farage, you go to Dulwich College or whatever, you're always going to have, there's going to be a drama studio, there's going to be music facilities, there's going to be trips to the theatre, so this political class are happy for all these lovely things for their own children, but, ordinary kids, they can learn to, do whatever basic jobs. They can be good little workers, or the girls can be good little breeders, the boys can be good little soldiers, and they can get on and do the jobs that suit the economy, but they shouldn't have the special stuff, But that special stuff, having access, I came from a lower middle class migrant family, childhood in the 70s and 80s, and I had music lessons and trips to the theatre and drama lessons. And I'm not working in the arts. I'm not that particularly talented, but the benefit to my life and probably to my confidence, and is you just can't measure that. And why shouldn't every child have that? Why should my generation have benefited from it? You know, like free university education, by the way, and then pull up the ladder.
I'm not looking at my phone, just in case anyone thought that was the most rude thing. I am checking the time to make absolute sure that I give enough time to audience questions. I've got 3 minutes until I do that, and you did just mention Nigel Farage, so I can't let him fall away. I mean, would you say that in the time since writing this book and the paperback coming out, a threat there to human rights is one that worries you more, or do you think that it shouldn't be a significant threat?
Well, it is a concern. I mean, we've got to be honest about this again. If you look at the polls, if you look at their success and the rise of reform, having a parliamentary foothold at the last election, winning, was it 10 councils in the local elections, doing so well in the polls, it is very troubling, because this is a populist far-right party that would tear up these precious protections and probably privatise the NHS as well. And the NHS is just such a wonderful, wonderful... So that's my patriotism. You know, there'd be some people who think that I'm a very unpatriotic, sort of international cosmopolitan type, you know, daughter of migrants, you know, lawyer, all that sort of negative stuff. But my patriotism isn't red, white and blue. It's blue and white, and it's the NHS. And it even has the word national in it.
Okay, I'm going to hand over to all of you. Can I just please gently ask that you ask questions, just so we can get through as many as possible, rather than perhaps stories. So quite pointed questions, if you could. And we'll take 3 at a time. So, great. One first here in the second row, and then there's a question there and here.
Hi, thank you. That was really great. Mine's quite controversial. Do you really think we actually have human rights today in any shape or form? They exist in statute, but actually we have a world which is full of people and political parties who have weaponized human rights, and they don't actually, whatever they don't like, they just ignore it. Now, it's enough to say, well, we should all stand up and try and fight for it, but we are completely impotent against the structure in the political system and the structure today. And coming back to your point in the UN and the Security Council, there are 198, I think, at the last count, countries in the world, of which 140 countries have recognized the state of Gaza. But they are completely impotent, and because the 4 or 5, and actually the US in particular, can decide to veto everything. So we don't actually have a United Nations which is actually working, and who is going to actually transform that so there's one country, one vote?
Are there human rights at all?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think there is.
Yeah.
That one there, and then the third one here.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about the relationship that you made between 1945 and 2020. The suggestion to me is that there kind of has to be this global catastrophe or global tragedy in order for a period of idealized collaboration. Do you think that those kind of peaks and troughs are inevitable? Or do you think there could be a stability? And following on from that, do you think that in the modern world with, you know, problems of social media, as you mentioned, and like the desensitized like nature of violence, do you think that kind of neutralizes the potential of having these peaks, these idealized peaks?
Do 3.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you, Shami. Thank you very much indeed. And this slightly leads on from the first great question. Thank you too. Do you think, in fact, the original sin, maybe, of the UN's structure is this search for consensus? It's not democratic. Actually, we all have to agree, otherwise it's all thrown out. The majority voting surely must be, and I just ask, with the forthcoming failure of the so-called Plastics Treaty, will be because, we've got to have consensus. Nothing will happen. We need majority voting and the lack of the power of the veto. I'm asking you, please.
So I'll do the first and the last together because they are related. Yours is a bit more specific about the thing, about Gaza and the problems with the UN mechanism. I do think the veto, I do think the permanent members fixed in stone and the veto is a problem. However, in the book, I talk about ways in which even from the 50s, in the context of the Korean War, the General Assembly started experimenting with passing resolutions in order to nudge the Security Council, and that has been used even around Gaza. So, even absent reforming the UN structure, which I would like to see at some point, but again, you need these leaders who are going to. Where are the Roosevelts and Churchills? But anyway, I would like to see reform of the structure, but even before that, you can do things more organically. And, there could be regional groups of countries that step up if the UN is stuck in a rut. So there's quite a lot that can happen. And there is customary international law that develops in a more organic way than treaties. So there is potential for progressive change, I think. And who knows, maybe what is happening, the terrible, terrible scenes from Gaza will provoke and accelerate some kind of change. I certainly hope so. Do we have human rights at all? Yes, we do. You and I are women, and we have the vote, and we have property rights, and we have all sorts of rights that we just did not have 100 years ago. We cannot say we do not have human rights. And this is a very, very, very challenging moment. I acknowledge that, but I don't think we should say we do not have right. There are some precious protections that we have here in the UK that people don't have all over the world, and we certainly didn't have until relatively recently, historically. So I think it's quite important to remember that. There's more we have to do, no question, and I share your frustration and anger, but I don't think we should say human rights are nonsense, we don't have them, because we do, and it's a struggle, but sometimes it's 10 steps back and 2 steps forward, but it's not all bleak. There is progress. And then the question about, does it take a kind of cataclysmic world event? I think I'm quite sympathetic to your analysis, actually, that sometimes rights advancement kind of leaps forward after a cataclysmic moment, whether it's a revolution or a conquest or a world war. And I guess that's why I talked about COVID, is, I thought when people had experienced lockdown and we lost, I think, twice as many civilians during COVID in the UK as we lost for the whole of World War II. Yeah? And now people have sort of scotomized it. Is that the sort of Freudian word for something so awful that we pretend it didn't happen, or we wipe it from our memories because it was a bad experience? But coming out of that moment, coming out of lockdown and all those deaths, all those untimely deaths of older people who were tipped out of hospital into care homes untested, some bad stuff happened, and now we've got this inquiry that will take a long time. That could have been, and it was a global crisis, that could have been a moment if there had been leaders to step up and say, right, never again will we manage something like this so badly. There are further biological threats of this kind, and we will. I mean, one of the things that breaks my heart is the vaccine inequality. You know, we were so glad of the vaccines when they came, and Big Pharma would not give the recipes to Creative Commons so that people in the global south could just produce the vaccine. You know, places in South Africa, India, parts of Latin America, they've got all the capacity to produce pharmaceuticals, not least because of the AIDS experience. And there was this thing called there's this thing at the WTO, the World Trade Organization, called the TRIPS waiver. You can waive basically international copyright in an emergency so that people can produce the stuff. And the certain countries stopped that happening. The countries were Switzerland, Germany, Britain, basically governments in the pocket of Big Pharma. And I thought that was just appalling. And that should not have happened, and that should not happen in the future if there's another pandemic. You know, drugs companies are entitled to make a profit. And they make a profit whether we live or die. If we live a bit longer, they can sell us more this, that, and the other medications, right? Whatever's in your bathroom cabinet, they can keep selling us stuff for every ache and pain and cough and cold and cancer and whatever. They don't need to watch millions of people die because they can't get the vaccine. And one of the things I talk about in the book is that image, which I'll never forget, of there's this company called the Serum Institute in India that was producing vaccines to send to Europe. And they had a facility in Kolkata, I think, and there were dead bodies floating down the Ganges River. In the end, people were banging on the doors of because you're producing this vaccine for profit to send to the West, and we've got bodies floating down the Ganges River. That is not okay. That is like, the building's on fire, this building is on fire, and if you want to know where the emergency exits and staircases are, you've got to give me a certain amount of money. And if you don't get shown the emergency exit, right? So I think COVID could have been the moment, but there are so many massive issues and threats of a global nature that it shouldn't be difficult to generate the moment, because it is a very heady moment. But I do think you have a point that sometimes it's these moments after a terrible atrocity, conflict, revolution that creates a sort of potential for thinking about rights and moving forward.
I think we've got probably time for two more questions, yeah. So one there and behind, yeah.
Thank you. I agree with what you said about the UN and the Security Council. I think Kofi Annan addressed that many years ago. I just wanted to say about, in some ways, maybe it isn't so different. I accept that there is a huge attack. There's been a neoliberal attack over 50 years. And you talk about the UN Declaration of 1948, and you know, the UN Security Council being flawed, but also the declaration, is it not perhaps the case that the economic rights and equality in that document were not strong enough in the original one, and that led to the opening of the backlash against Keynesianism, if you like, and that's what you see the attack. You see the structure today, the investor-state dispute settlements, 3,000, direct undermining of democracy, absolute direct.
It's a fascinating question, and,
Okay.
and we're talking about when we talk about different groups of rights, we've talked about absolute rights and qualified rights, we've talked about cultural rights, but of course a big distinction and a big debate that you have very kindly amplified is the one around social and economic rights on the one hand and civil and political rights on the other hand, which I try to discuss in the book. And of course, some people on the left in particular get very cross about human rights because they think that human rights mechanisms are not muscular enough on the social and economic rights. They are different in different jurisdictions. I mean, for example, in the South African constitution, there's a lot more justiciability and court adjudication around social and economic rights. And when you start thinking about things like water, which is it's an essential of life, but it's a social economic provision rather than a civil and political one, you realise how important these rights are. I guess I can some people said, because you were dealing at the time with the Soviet Union on the one hand and the US on the other hand, the very different political worldviews, it is astonishing that they managed to agree anything. Now, the Universal Declaration's fine because it's got no enforcement mechanism anyway. So that's the love poem. Universal Declaration, a declaration of rights is like a declaration of love. I love you, but that doesn't mean anything. That doesn't mean I'm going to be with you for more than one night or I'm going to look after you. It just means I love you, right? So it can be beautiful, poetic, inspirational, but it's not where the beef is, right? That comes from the regional treaties and domestic instruments and bills of rights and constitutions and human rights acts and whatever. And there we do see this different delivery mechanism depending on whether they're civil and political rights and social and economic ones. There is some, I think, practical justification for it, which is some of these things are easier delivered by politics than by law. You know, the NHS, which is a wonderful, I think it's one of the greatest progressive political progressive experiments in world history, is delivered by politics. And ultimately, you want to hold your politicians to account if those waiting lists, you know, don't go down and if people aren't getting the care that they deserve. Not sure that the courts are primarily the best place to be deciding what the priorities should be in that setting. There is a law to protect you. If you've been treated appallingly and negligently, then you can, you know, but that's different from actually saying lawyers and courts are the best place to do the primary delivery of social and economic rights. Judges are very reluctant to get involved in that terrain, and we shouldn't, as lawyers and human rights people, rob politics of its very important democratic role. So there's, you know, there are nuances and balances to be struck, but at the end of the day, human rights, you know, social and economic rights and civil and political rights and cultural rights are all needed. They're everything that we need to survive and thrive as humans with some prospect of thriving and living our best lives. And you can't separate them and say, and I always say to people, if someone came to your house and they end up staying overnight because the trains are cancelled or something, you would never dream of saying to them, well, okay, you're staying tonight, you can have some supper with us, you can eat the food or you can contribute to the conversation, but you can't have both. And you can sleep in the spare room, but the door has to be open the whole time and you can't close the door and have your privacy. You just wouldn't make a separation between civil rights and social and economic rights. So it's just a nonsense. It's all about, ultimately, it's all about treating humans with dignity and treating them really as you would like to be treated yourself. The key to the human rights kingdom is equal treatment. It's the most important human right of all. And people go, well, how can you say that, Shami? Surely torture and slavery. And I'm like, if we had equal treatment, there would be no torture and slavery. It's the most important discipline because it requires each of us to imagine that we are in the small boat. Or we are the trans person who just wants to live a quiet life and not be vilified in the media the whole time. It's just that empathy, that walking in someone else's shoes, you know. That's the key to the kingdom, I think.
Okay, well, yeah, but time then, just for one very quick last question, because I know people do have to.
Thank you. Very quickly, you mentioned earlier that you have less of a libertarian approach to free speech online. I wanted to ask where you think we'd be able to draw that distinction between the online and the offline world in an age where we're increasingly online, and if we are to adopt a less libertarian approach to free speech online, how are we able to reckon with that at a time with the Trump administration who have more of a libertarian approach to free speech?
Look, it's a very good point. And I said it in a sort of slightly lazy blanket kind of statement, which is not desperately helpful. But I was really thinking about things like the deep fake intimate images. I wasn't wanting to censor people's opinions, particularly online. I think there is quite a lot of applicable law that just doesn't get applied and enforced online. There are people issuing death threats and rape threats on social media on a daily basis, and there isn't enough police enforcement of it, in my view. And if the basic adage is supposed to be, if it's illegal offline, it's illegal online. If you are issuing these threats and behaving in this way, but in practice, that doesn't work because the cops and the justice system is, on its knees in terms of resources, and some people are just not trained and able to do what needs to be done. So there's got to be improvement there. But I think when I say I'm less libertarian than I was, it's because of the new threats that I couldn't have imagined years ago, like these deep fake images. And I think it's a perfectly proportionate interference with someone's free expression to say you cannot create a deep fake pornographic image of a woman without her consent, or a person without their consent. And if that means I'm not an absolute libertarian about free expression, so be it. I don't think you should be able to issue death threats, rape threats either. That is a perfectly legitimate, proportionate interference with free speech. But it's just that with some of this new technology, we have to kind of reimagine, because some of the analogies just don't work. Because there are some of these technologies generate possibilities that you can't even apply to the physical world, because it's happening, like the deep fake images and so on. But what the degradation and the mental health implications, and even just changing the relationship between boys and girls and men and women, these are things that are so serious and important that I think it is a proportionate interference with free expression to regulate that.
Thank you for your very brilliant questions, and for keeping them as questions. Very grateful, and thank you all very much for coming. Shami, thank you very, very much indeed. We'll be signing it at the back just there. Thank you.